That's beyond your control, Brad. So, well, thanks for inviting me. It's been really fun. I've actually never been here before, so is it possible to turn? That's great. Perfect. Perfect. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about sea level change, and in particular, I'm going to talk about sea level in the context of ice sheets. And when we think about that, it kind of makes sense to go back about 20,000 years and look at the world during the last glacial maximum. As I'm sure you all know, we had extensive ice sheets, all indicated in white, that do not exist anymore. The only ones that remain really are Antarctica and Greenland. So obviously there's been a long-standing interest in the relationship between this big deglaciation that played out over, say, about 15,000 years, and how that affected sea level globally as well as regionally. So when we talk about that and we focus on the last deglaciation, it is virtually impossible to do that without using this kind of benchmark paper as a starting point. This is, I think we can say with confidence will remain a classic forever. This paper by Rick Fairbanks. This is a sea level record from Barbados. And the reason this paper was so important, there were several reasons. First of all, it was the first fairly complete record of sea level change anywhere that went all the way back into the time near the last glacial maximum and then tracked this huge sea level rise all the way into essentially into the present. So that in itself made the study highly significant. In some ways, perhaps even more interesting, this study gave the first really compelling hints that this deglaciation was far from linear. You can see that there are phases with clearly accelerated rates of sea level rise, and the one that has gained a lot of attention is actually being confirmed by subsequent studies to be a very significant feature. It's something that is now actually Fairbanks already named Meltwater Pulse 1A, so this is kind of the widely used acronym. This is a really incredible phenomenon. We're talking about more than 10 meters of sea level rise that occurred within just a couple of centuries. And there is still a lot of interest in this Meltwater Pulse 1A, and in particular, and I will get back to that towards the end of my talk, there is pretty vigorous debate about what was the primary source of this meltwater pulse, where did most of the meltwater actually come from. And that is still not fully resolved. So, the importance is that we now know that even if, let's say, if we change temperature in a fairly steady way, as maybe we're doing right now and we continue to do in the future, the ice sheets will respond, but they're unlikely to respond in a linear way. And so we have to be prepared for these types of, really dramatic events, perhaps not as dramatic as this one, but still dramatic enough that they really matter. The reason I show this is I will actually spend a pretty substantial part of the talk focusing on smaller scale, what we now sometimes call sea level jumps, that not the kind of 10-meter scale stuff like Meltwater Pulse 1A, but things that are, decimeter to meter scale, that have occurred later on in this record, and that, as you can imagine, are still very relevant to, understanding what sea level might do in the future. So when we think about the Holocene, because I will really zoom in on especially the early Holocene, we can look at this temperature record for the basically for the Holocene, and what we see is that the early Holocene in particular was a period of relatively high temperatures that then kind of dropped and bottomed out in the Little Ice Age and then humans really started getting involved on a large scale, and things ramped up very rapidly. Interestingly, this paper that, as you can see, came out just a few years ago, at that point, global temperatures were just starting to rise, perhaps barely above the levels that we saw during the early Holocene. Add in the last few years, and it's clear that we are now getting out of that range and entering kind of uncharted territory, at least within the context of the Holocene. The reason I show this is that the early Holocene is probably the most recent interglacial warm period that has seen, high rates of sea level rise and rapid rates of land-based ice loss. So from that point of view, it's an obvious natural analog for what we expect in the future to look into. Within the sea level community, there is a lot of interest in these past warm periods, as you probably know. A lot of people focus heavily on the last interglacial, which is about 125,000 years ago. I will make the point later on that this is actually a surprisingly understudied period within this context. I'll speculate a little bit on why that might be, but it's something we can really learn a lot more by zooming in on this time interval, and that's something I will try to do. So if we look at a very generalized, globally averaged sea level record for this last deglaciation, looks something like this. This is a simplistic approach. There's no attempt is made to correct for coastal motion, so it only gives the big picture. What I really want to show here is the early Holocene, where you kind of starts ramping up to rates on the order of, say, roughly a centimeter per year of globally average sea level rise. And so that is what we saw during that time period from, say, 11 to 7,000 years ago, or somewhere in that range. And as you can imagine, this is, those kinds of rates are within the range of the rates that, are predicted for, later in this century. So that's another reason why, we are interested in this time interval. So if you're interested in the last deglaciation, and in particular this ice sheet sea level relationship, probably the best resource right now is a huge review paper by Anders Carlson and Peter Clark that came out in 2012. And the reason I show this is to try to make this point that I mentioned earlier, that the early Holocene is so surprisingly understudied. Because here again we see that globally average sea level record. This is something that may be hard to read in the back of the room, but this is section 10 of this very long paper. And section 10 is really the part that deals with the Holocene part of the record. It's probably about 5 pages long, whereas the paper is 72 pages long. So nevertheless, as is pointed out here, most of the remaining 60 meters of global sea level rise happened actually during the early Holocene. So that is roughly half the total deglacial sea level rise happened during this time, and it's not been very widely studied. So for those, some of you have inquired about what was behind my title. So we're going to focus on this time period, which is basically after halftime of the last deglaciation, at least from a sea level perspective. So why does the early Holocene matter? I think I've hopefully made the point. I just want to summarize here. It's essentially the most recent portion of Earth history with, rapid ice melt under interglacial conditions. The rates are within the range of projections that we have for later this century. And it is also, and this is a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but it's certainly something I'm very interested in with other research projects within my group. It's a great opportunity to study coastal impacts and basically the coastal response during periods like the early Holocene. It can tell us a lot about what may happen in the future. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about how I actually got interested in this in the first place. I had an interest in studying Holocene sea level change for a number of reasons. One was that in the early 2000s, I started to get interested in understanding subsidence rates in coastal Louisiana, which is a big issue there. And then one day, a student walked into my office, a guy by the name Scott Bick, and he was interested in getting involved in this kind of messy field work that we do. And basically the purpose of his study was to look at this subsidence problem, and in particular he was working in these areas here. He started working in this area right here, and the reason was that there were previous studies that suggested that there was a big fault system that ran in between these areas, and he wanted to use sea level records to figure out, what the significance of that fault system might be. So what happened, and this is kind of an interesting example of, how sometimes you can stumble upon something you didn't expect. And I'm not going to show this in any detail. The bottom line is that Scott's findings regarding that fault were kind of disappointing. We didn't really see much of anything. But in that new study area, he found evidence for a very abrupt sea level rise that happened in the early Holocene, and that we ended up linking to the 8.2 cooling event. I'll talk more about that in a few moments. So this was kind of the earliest discovery, and that kind of ultimately led to the work we're doing today and hopefully in the future. So I'll just mention a number of people who've been involved in this work. It's basically a series of postdocs. I'll talk at some length about Frank Lee's work that really gave us a very nice, well-constrained record on sea level change around that 8.2 K cooling event. Mark Heima was another postdoc. I'll show some of his work. Some of you may have met Spider, a postdoc who was here working in Brad's lab for a couple of weeks, sometime about a year ago, I guess. The current postdoc, Elena Stepanidis, she literally showed up a couple of weeks ago, so she's going to carry this project forward in the next few years. There's many more collaborators than the people I mentioned here, one of whom obviously you know. I want to single out Glenn Milne, who is a GIA modeler, who is a good friend, and he's been involved in a variety of things, both in our past work, but also in work that we hope to do in the future. And obviously there were various sources of funding that have supported this work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 8.2 event, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but maybe not all. These are some earlier ice core records from Greenland, and this is actually from the late 80s. And this is when it started to become clear that glacial climates were notoriously unstable with these very abrupt climate fluctuations. The reason I show this is actually a very obscure book chapter by an otherwise, extremely famous person. These abrupt events that you see here are now known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events, so obviously this guy had something to do with it. What's interesting here is that the most recent of these events, which actually occurs in the Holocene, we're basically looking here at the last glacial, and here we are transitioning into the Holocene. So event number 10 here is this relatively small little blip. It's a short-lived cooling that happened, according to this, about 8,230 years ago. Now, the interesting thing is, if you read the paper, this book chapter, there is no mention of this anywhere in the text. The only place it appears is in this figure. So clearly, Dansgaard knew that something was going on there, but for whatever reason, he didn't spend any language further discussing it. So about 10 years later, Richard Alley published a landmark paper that was entirely basically put the 8.2 event on the map, and well, the rest is history, as they say. Yeah?
Just
Oh, okay.
So I don't think they understand the isotopic implication and what the direction of the changing isotopes
Yeah.
the measurements were on.
Okay. Well, without going into any detail, which I don't think is necessary, we're looking here at essentially a temperature curve. So basically, when these wiggles go to the left, it's cold, and when they go to the right, it's warm. So you can see the main warming is happening right here. And so this is our transition going from the last ice age into the current, warm period, which is known as the Holocene. So, but then superimposed on that, we have these little blips, these cold phases. So the idea is that this 8.2 event was caused by the abrupt drainage of this proglacial lake that occurred in front of the Laurentide ice sheet when it was melting away. You can kind of see here the final stage of this lake. This is about to fall apart, and suddenly you have this massive amount of fresh water that is going to drain into the North Atlantic Ocean. And what that does, it basically dramatically changes ocean currents and the transport of heat to these high latitudes. And as a result, you get this dramatic cooling. There is now a huge amount of climate records that show cooling right around that time, indicated by all these blue dots map. And in addition, climate models can do a pretty decent job at reproducing this, the impact of that abrupt drainage of this proglacial lake. So one of the interesting questions is, there's actually several interesting questions that came out of this. One of them relates to this Lake Agassiz, as it's known. The big question is, how much water actually went into the ocean at that time? Well, this is a study that did a really nice job of trying to estimate the total water volume. And as you can see, it led to a pretty precise number. But the truth is that it's not very well constrained, because we don't really know in great detail where the ice front was at this very final stage of Lake Agassiz. So that really matters a lot, because you can see that this, the area near that ice margin that was right here is also the deepest part of the lake. So if you shift that ice margin around, that water volume can change a lot. So a kind of an inverse approach to figure out how much water went into the ocean would be to look at sea level records that are detailed enough to actually reconstruct the magnitude of the abrupt sea level rise that should have happened around that time. So one area where that has been done is actually in my home country by Mark Heima, who this was part of his PhD work before he came to Tulane to do a postdoc. This is the area around Rotterdam, and what's indicated here is a deposit that is very widespread in the subsurface and indicates abrupt flooding. So he put together a very nice sea level record with a lot of information that I'm not going to go into in any detail. The bottom line is that right around somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000, oh, wait a minute, pushing the wrong button here. Between 8,000 and 9,000 years ago, there was this large sea level jump on the order of about 2 meters, give or take some error. So if we put some of the information together that existed at the time, what you see here is a time scale. The yellow bar indicates when that abrupt cooling around 8,200 years ago, when that started. And these bars indicate when, the best estimates we had at the time of when Lake Agassiz drained. This is from our earlier work that is, kind of pointed towards the 8.2 event, but was not very tightly constrained. This is Mark's work that overlaps quite a bit with our record, but it also is a little bit older. And this is actually the study that first proposed Lake Agassiz, and that rapid drainage was the cause of this abrupt cooling. As you can see, the error bar is very, very large. And the central value here is actually 8,500 years ago. So it's actually significantly older than the 8.2 event. So in other words, the chronology is not very tightly constrained. So there are basically two things we're interested in. Can we do a better job with matching up that abrupt sea level rise with the actual climate event in terms of timing? And can we maybe extract some more information on how much meltwater went into the ocean? So that brings us to the work that Frank did. He started using the geoprobe. Prior to that, our previous work was all done by hand. But as you can imagine, we're talking about relatively deep records well below, this is 15 meters below the surface. So hand drilling became a little too challenging. I want to show you a typical sediment core and very briefly go over how we actually reconstruct sea level. And the main proxy we use is what we call basal peat. So what you see here is a transition from the initial marsh peat that forms because of the rise in sea level and basically the drowning of the landscape. Underlying is Pleistocene sediment. And there's one feature here in between, this dark gray stuff, which I want to point out because I'll briefly get back to that later. This is actually a paleosol. It's kind of a weak A-horizon that forms generally under marine influenced conditions and essentially indicates the very first effect of rising sea level prior to the full transition into a full-blown wetland that accumulates peat. So we generally sample the base of that peat and radiocarbon date it, measure its elevation, and that's basically how we get the data points that tell us how sea level changed over time. So I'll show you some of Frank's results, and I'm going to try not to go into too much detail here, but basically this is a set of cores. You can see elevations vary from place to place. At the bottom we have this underlying Pleistocene sediment everywhere. The brown is that paleosol, and then the black and the gray indicates very, very, very thin marsh peat layers that indicates that initial transgression